Hello, my name is Dragonkeeper, and I would like to discuss the show RWBY, more specifically, the character Mercury and the philosophical implications of his character. Before this discussion, however, I would like to preface by saying I apologize for any potential disrespect that may be implied from this discussion. I am in no way trying to discredit any kind of value you might gain by relating to Mercury's situation. If you relate to Mercury, please call this hotline, 1-800-799-7233. I wish to examine Mercury Black within the academic lens of toxic masculinity. Specifically, I will be arguing around the definition of toxic masculinity provided by Wikipedia, which is,
in social sciences, toxic masculinity refers to traditional cultural masculine norms that can be harmful to men, women, and society overall. This concept of toxic masculinity does not condemn men or male attributes, but rather emphasizes the harmful effects of conformity to certain traditional masculine ideals, behaviors such as dominance, self-reliance, and competition. Toxic masculinity is thus defined by adherence to traditional male gender roles that consequently stigmatize and limit the emotion boys and men may comfortably express while elevating other emotions such as anger.
Within the world of RWBY, there are countless occurrences of characters and scenes that represent real-life philosophical dilemmas, and more importantly, reflect real-world toxic ideas. The character that embodies this examination within RWBY to a T is Mercury Black, a ruthless assassin initially working for Cinder but now works for Salem. Mercury is an assassin who was raised by an abusive and alcoholic father. However, I would like to restructure the common narrative in which Mercury is analyzed. I believe it is unfair that Mercury is considered strictly an abuse victim, when there are deeper implications within his story. He is an abuse victim, but how does that play into the greater story? How does Mercury's story differ between other forms of abuse seen in RWBY? And is there purpose behind each aspect of his life? People commonly associate Mercury with strictly abuse, which I think is improper. I think there's a greater idea behind Mercury's character, which is, Mercury is a symbol for the indoctrination of toxic masculinity youth, emphasizing that Mercury has continued with this belief system, forging him into a toxic and ruthless individual, and that teaching toxic masculine traits to youth is inherently abusive. I will be splitting up my argument into 6 sections. The meaning of semblances, the meaning of strength, paternal and maternal abuse styles, then focusing on Mercury with aggression, repressed emotion, and dominance. To begin this analysis, there needs to be an establishment on what semblances represent in RWBY. Or rather, what do they stand as a metaphor for? There are grounds for an argument based in the idea that semblances and aura are representative of coping mechanisms, or rather manifestations of how they cope. Basically, the way in which people cope with grief in RWBY manifests in a semblance for these characters. As for how this is contextualized within RWBY, an analysis on a few characters is required before discussing Mercury's character, so that there is proper understanding and emphasis on why Mercury not having a semblance is evidence for my claim. To begin, the character of Adam Taurus, a cunning and manipulative warrior and subsequent leader of the White Fang. Adam Taurus' semblance is not officially given a name within the show. However, it is clearly defined by Blake as being like Yang's semblance.
His semblance is like yours. He absorbs energy through his sword, stores it up, and then sends it back when he's ready. He gets to dish out damage without having to feel it. That's just cheap.
Adam uses his sword to absorb energy from his attacker and turns it against them. His semblance is a metaphor for how he responds to people that try to bring criticism towards him. For example, as he is speaking to Blake about how he murdered another human, Blake brings forward valid criticism about his actions. Adam retorts about how it is the right thing to do, and then when people fight, people die.
So when you fight, people get hurt. What, do you want me to just abandon our cause? Like your parents?
No! I'm not saying that. I don't know.
Which visibly hurts Blake. Adam completely deflects any criticism and frames Blake's parents as weak and cowardly, completely avoiding the criticism Blake brought up and subsequently hurting Blake's feelings. In this scene, like his semblance, he stored up the pain and sent it back when it was convenient for him to do so, avoiding any potential damage to his psyche in the process. There is a clear correlation with his semblance and how he actively treats people around him. Comparatively speaking, in the beginning of the character short, Adam is seen uttering the words,
"It's time we got what we deserve."
Indicates some sort of collective end goal. However, contrasting this idea is in the end of the character short where Adam remarks,
"It's time I got what I deserved,"
indicating that he truly only cares for himself. He is constantly depicted as using other people's strengths against him to further a goal of some kind, using Blake's courage to stand up against him to critique her. Keep in mind, there is no evidence to imply that Adam's semblance has been used to help anyone other than himself. The only occurrence to counter this fact is when a human was trying to shoot Gira, which it is highly implausible that Gira is any real danger, considering his aura was not even broken. The only person seen reassuring Adam was Sienna, who he kills anyways to gain control of the White Fang, once again, using the support she gave him as subsequent strength just to kill her the moment she starts to criticize his actions. So Adam is a character who uses the strength and support of others and turns it against them when it becomes convenient for him to do so. His semblance is a direct metaphor for how he deals with criticism entirely, waiting for the time where a person shows criticism to send out his stored up strength. It is his way of coping with grief. He turns it on the critic, just like his semblance. To continue this analysis on how semblances represent unhealthy coping mechanisms, an analysis on Yang could prove handy, considering her semblance is directly referred by Blake to be like Adam's semblance. As a character, Yang is seen as a very bombastic person in earlier volumes, making constant jokes, punching bad guys, and being very flamboyant. Contrasting this persona with Adam's persona seems rather odd. If the semblance is an extension of the person's way of life and coping mechanisms associated with their grief, how can two people who are so drastically different be similar in any way? As discussed before, Adam is a manipulative person. Yang describes his relationship with Blake, remarking,
Did she make that promise to you? Or to the person you were pretending to be?
Adam fakes a persona so that he can avoid the pain associated with the grief he should feel, kind of like his semblance. This persona would be his sword, in which he attacks people that critique him. This persona is reflected in Yang's personality, but with a catch. While Adam has this persona so that he can avoid grief and trauma, Yang's false persona is reactionary to the trauma she feels, which so happens to be the difference between their semblances. When scavenging the Whale Grim during Volume 8, Yang makes a witty remark to Ren. Ren, being able to see through Yang's false persona, seeing the true emotions within her, retorts,
It's okay to be afraid, you know.
While Yang is presenting herself as this very bombastic and flamboyant character, she is afraid and is indeed suffering, which she even recognizes herself, responding immediately by saying,
Glad I'm not the only one who's scared.
She recognizes this persona as a front, while Adam does not recognize his persona as a front, even denying the idea outright when Yang questions whether he was the same person Blake made her promise to. Adam says,
So I just wasn't good enough for you.
Yang and Adam's semblances are similar, and so is their way of coping with grief, being they put up false fronts to people around them. Yang feels the pain and responds with her persona, while Adam's persona is his sword, and takes the damage instead for him. So that concludes the talk about semblances with Yang and Adam, but how about for other people in the show? Are there any other examples which in semblances represent a person's coping mechanism? Of course, there is grounds for this claim with just these references, but how could anyone be sure these two are not outliers? Analyzing a few more characters should suffice as evidence to prove that semblances are metaphors for their wielder's coping mechanism. Blake Belladonna, a character that has deep relationships to the aforementioned characters, has a semblance that leaves behind a copy of her to take a hit for her as she runs away. It is important to note that Blake herself recognizes that her semblance has an uncanny resemblance to how she deals with problems. Yang brings up how Blake is not one to back down from a challenge. However, Blake responds by saying,
But I am. I do it all the time. When you learned I was a faunus, I didn't know what to do, so I ran. When I realized my oldest partner had become a monster, I ran. Even my semblance. I was born with the ability to leave behind a shadow of myself. An empty copy that takes the hit while I run away.
Blake recognizes that her coping mechanism resembles her semblance to a T. Blake's semblance is a direct metaphor for how she copes. The claim that semblances are metaphors for the character's coping mechanism is so apparent, the character recognizes the similarity herself, signifying there is more to semblances that they're strict physical manifestations of an aura. Another example of a character that has a semblance resembling of their coping mechanism is Weiss. Weiss's semblance is summoning, where she can summon up enemies that she had defeated in the past. Specifically, those who have caused her great turmoil. One example of Weiss's semblance being reflected in her character is how when she is riding the elevator in Volume 2, Episode 3, she is seen trying to force a smile as she arrives to the proper floor. She is trying to summon up old feelings and emotions that she no longer naturally feels when being near her past. Her father subsequently defeated her happiness to the point where she must summon a fake smile, which is so short-lived, the second it is no longer needed, the smile fades. Like how Weiss's summons fade when she is no longer in combat. Her semblance is once again a metaphor for how she copes with the given trauma in her life. Now that semblances have been discussed, there needs to be a discussion on the idea of strength in RWBY. What does strength mean? Well, according to RWBY, strength is directly comparable to courage, not actual physical strength. Physical strength and might is mostly associated with the word power, with people like Cinder saying,
I want to be strong.
A beautiful ring for a beautiful woman.
I'm sorry.
I want to be feared.
What? Impossible! What did it...
I want to be powerful.
She directly states one after another. It would not make sense if both words meant actual strength, meaning that strength must mean something else. Strength has often been misinterpreted as well, often by characters wielding massive amounts of power. More specifically, Raven, wielder of the Spring Maiden power. Raven talks about how she is strong, that she has the strength required to do the things she does. She associates strength with power and subsequently confuses the two. This confusion is exemplified by Yang. She says,
You don't know the first thing about strength. You turn your back on people. You run away when things get too hard. You put others in harm's way instead of yourself. You might be powerful, but that doesn't make you strong.
so not only is the word strength used in conjunction with power, meaning if they both meant actual strength, it would be redundant, but we have a main character, an ally to the protagonist, declaring that power does not make you strong. Cinder and Yang's dialogue would imply that strength is not synonymous with actual strength, but rather is synonymous with courage and willingness to stand your ground. Last thing before discussing Mercury, there needs to be a discussion on how mothers in RWBY abuse their children and how that differentiates between Mercury's paternal abuse. In every case in which a mother in RWBY can be described as abusive, they are seen ignoring their kids or straight abandoning them. Take, for instance, Willow, who abuses her kids by neglecting them to the point where she would lock herself in her room to drink for weeks at a time, or Raven, who abandoned Yang the moment she was born to be with her tribe. Arguably the most egregious form of parental abuse. Or take, for instance, Emerald's family, who abandoned Emerald because they did not love her. Specifically, Emerald being abandoned by her family is not described as her parents leaving her, but rather Mercury remarked,
Sorry you didn't have a mommy that loved you, but I had a father who hated me.
indicating that abandonment is strictly associated with maternal abuse, while physical abuse is associated with paternal abuse. There have been no significant instances of fathers abandoning their kids at all within RWBY. Each case of abandonment is directly associated with maternal abuse and maternal diction, while physical abuse is directly associated with paternal diction. Mercury even states, I had a father who hated me, indicating that physical abuse is strictly a male-oriented problem. Ending the discussion on things not Mercury, analyzing Mercury required analyzing other aspects of the show to make sense as to why each aspect of Mercury's character is what it is, and why not having a semblance is indicative of further philosophical importance. Mercury's character is a commentary on how damaging toxic masculinity can be on a person, and how indoctrinating the ideals of toxic masculinity to children is inherently abusive and immoral. Mercury is a very sadistic and crude character, often making witty remarks and violently snarking at people who critique him. Think of the first time the viewer sees Mercury past veil, as Watt retorts,
Yes, please keep your posse in check.
Mercury's first reaction is to immediately start moving towards Watts to attack him. He exhibits aggression and sadistic behaviors over others frequently. His standard response to criticism is aggression and snarky comments. He cannot handle criticism. When Tyrion brings forward criticism about his life, Mercury tries to immediately attack him. Mercury's first response is,
You don't know me.
followed by an immediate attempt to kick him. He responds to the criticism by saying they are wrong and then immediately trying to fight whoever says otherwise. His go-to response to pain and suffering is aggression, as he has repressed emotions and an inability to cope, exemplified by his lack of a semblance, which, as discussed before, is a metaphor for coping mechanisms, meaning he does not have a way to cope. Again, we see him in Volume 5 exhibiting these behaviors while simultaneously being rewarded for it. Mercury and Emerald approach Raven's camp, asking for help. When Raven's guard denies it, Mercury and Cinder immediately suggest violence as an answer. Their conversation starts with Mercury.
Doesn't look like he wants to cooperate, boss.
Then make him.
I was hoping you'd say that.
He not only responds with violence, but hopes that he is able to respond with violence. He exhibits toxic masculine traits by trying to forcibly fight his way through his issues. In his own words, he hopes he can fight and hurt people to solve the issue. There are grounds to assume that Mercury has responded to criticism in his life the same way throughout, indicating this was a taught behavior, especially with him describing his father and his lifestyle as meant to be. Mercury is a challenged fellow. He was abused by his father every day to create this perfect assassin. Mercury's father, Marcus, wanted him to be an independent assassin, one who was powerful and not held back by things that made him weak. As understood by Mercury, Marcus wanted him to be strong. He even quotes Marcus by saying,
And when I unlocked my semblance, he stole it with his. This is a crutch. This makes you weak. He told me I could have it back when I was strong. So I got strong. But I never got it back. I think I'm right where I'm supposed to be.
Understanding the idea of what semblances represent and what the meaning of strength is in Ruby, interpreting this quote is easier by breaking it down into parts. First, Mercury talks about how his semblance was stolen by his father, that his father claimed it made him weak. This action is quite like how masculine people are typically seen not expressing emotions or coping at all. It is frowned upon to cry or show emotion, to work things out. Emotions and coping is seen as a crutch for men. Even according to Marcus, this makes you weak. Meaning that Marcus carried some perverted ideal as to what coping does for someone. As people with semblances, coping mechanisms, are typically seen as stronger fighters, which is what Marcus wanted to do, create a stronger fighter. Marcus had a perverted idea as to what strength meant in accordance with physical power. He thought that they were synonymous with each other. However, as discussed before, strength is more attuned to courage and willpower, not physical strength. While intending to do the opposite, by taking away Mercury's semblance or his coping mechanism, he effectively made Mercury less powerful and weaker. Viewers understand that while Mercury may be a powerful assassin, he is not truly strong or courageous. The only fights he wins are quite unfair and rely on the people around him doing most of the work. Think of the hallucinations with Amber, or Cinder choosing the opponents for him with Coco and Yatsuhashi, or the fight with Yang, Mercury, and Emerald during Volume 5. Mercury's first and only true victory was against his father, in which he truly does not even win, as he continues to perpetuate his father's perverted view of strength. Going back to Marcus's semblance, as interpreted as a coping mechanism, means that he dealt with grief by taking away the coping mechanisms of others. He truly believed to a T that coping is so bad for someone that his coping mechanism is taking away other people's coping mechanisms. He exists as a character who, instead of training a truly strong and powerful huntsman, deprives Mercury of a valuable childhood, and instead instills this idea that he must be a strong assassin. The idea that Marcus wanted to make an assassin instead of a huntsman should itself indicate some sort of dilemma within Marcus. He, instead of properly teaching his kid, ruthlessly trained him to be a professional killer. This dilemma should instill an idea that Marcus was most likely a man who had a perverted idea of the world. Training an assassin instead of a huntsman, teaching his kid that coping made him weak and that he must be strong, but teaching him that strength meant power. This mindset indicates a common idea of toxic masculinity, where one believes he must be a manly man and an absolute force in the world of Remnant. As Mercury states,
"All my life, my father trained me to be a killer, an assassin like him."
There seems to be no indication that Marcus wanted anything other than to instill this mindset onto his kid. Marcus's worldview being instilled onto Mercury resulted in an abusive situation where Mercury was simply unable to cope because he was taught his entire life that it would make him weak. Mercury still continues down this path as well. He continues the life his father wanted him to live, as he says it was meant to be. With Tyrion even mocking him, saying,
"The world is mean, and I'm a big bad man now, just like the others."
Which, at the end of Tyrion's speech, Mercury's first response is to attack him, like his father taught him, confirming that Tyrion is right. Mercury is a victim of abuse, but his abuse came in the form of a father who tried to instill a toxic ideal into a young child who only wished to be what his father wanted. Toxic masculinity, being indoctrinated onto Mercury at a young age, pushes him into a life of endless pain and violence. As a result, it portrays a sad tale of abuse and misery. In the end, this portrays a character with deep mental and emotional repression, ultimately surfacing in these outbursts of rage, like trying to fight Tyrion, Watts, and even Emerald, the closest thing he has to a friend in Remnant. He even tries to escape the conversation with Emerald by telling her,
"If you're gonna start having a crisis of identity or some crap, keep me out of it."
He truly believes that allowing others to be a part of your life and help with emotional issues is bad for people. He refuses to help his friends through their issues, and truthfully, he refuses to help himself. He truly never confronts this lifestyle and questions his belief system. As Tyrion says it best, it is such a tragedy. Discussing dominance is quite simple with Mercury, as his wants are stated by him during Volume 6, Episode 9. Emerald starts talking about what Mercury truly wants from everything, saying,
"I mean, there has to be something you want from this, right?"
Salem's promised us everything. We win this thing for her, we'll be top dogs in her new world. What more do you want?
Mercury simply says he wants to be the top dog and be in a dominant position in the world. He kind of wants to be this alpha male where he has ultimate power over people in the world. Mercury wants to dominate, or at least be dominant, indicating another toxic masculine trait as defined by academia. He now satisfies the three parts of the definition. He wants to dominate, he has repressed emotions, and he is inherently aggressive. Now, before concluding, it feels appropriate to address some of the opposition. There was a Reddit post made on July 22nd, 2021 regarding thoughts on Mercury's character and the commentary on toxic masculinity. Some people decided to disagree and provide lengthy rebuttals to the post. Hopefully addressing these rebuttals will allow for some clarity and provide an answer to those who may disagree. More specifically, addressing most popular opinion and most popular opposition should provide some more clarity. Reddit user Consentai writes,
Yeah, all of this is a stretch. There is absolutely nothing to point to the idea that that's what Mercury's lack of semblance is a commentary on. There is no evidence in the show to support your idea that Mercury carries this manly man mentality, and even more egregiously, that Mercury embodies the idea of toxic masculinity to the core. Mercury seeks power and strength because that is the only way in which he's able to control his circumstances and have a semblance of safety, not because of some twisted idea of what it is to be a man.
To directly counter, it needs to be said that there is no textual evidence to support the idea that Mercury seeks any form of safety. In fact, the only time the viewer has heard anything about to a reason why Mercury does things is when he refers to his father about wanting to be strong and to be a top dog in Salem's New World. Never has Mercury suggested that he wishes to be safe. In fact, Mercury himself says felt like it was meant to be. Also, Consentai states that Mercury is supposed to be examined strictly through the lens of abuse, stating,
Completely scratch out Mercury is the embodiment of toxic masculinity and replace that with Mercury is a survivor of serious, long-term abuse at the hands of the one person who is supposed to protect and love him the most. And look at his behavior through that lens.
Which I think I provided enough evidence as to why the strict lens of abuse discredits much of Mercury's character. For the sake of argument, entertaining the idea of Mercury strictly being a stand-in for abuse means that his father taking his semblance has no philosophical importance at all, or that the perversion of strength is not a result of a mindset being instilled onto Mercury. Ignoring that Mercury also cannot deal with any criticism thrown his way, he is simply the man his father wanted him to be. He does not perpetuate the cycle of abuse. The purpose of Mercury is to be an abuse victim, however, strictly ruling out the idea that toxic masculinity is not an important factor, or as stated above, the most important factor of his character, does a great disservice to his character. He exhibits the behavior of a child who was taught a perverted worldview and perpetuates this idea even after his father's death. While his story is a story of abuse, it is important to realize that in this context, the abuse comes from the father's perverted worldview on coping and strength and instilling it into a child, which resulted in the abuse of Mercury Black. To conclude, Mercury symbolizes toxic masculinity and the dangers of teaching it to youth. Throughout the show, the viewer is shown how ruthless Mercury is, how he has repressed emotion, how he is inherently violent to people that disagree with him. Mercury's tragic story is one of abuse, one where he was taught that violence was the answer to all his issues, and that having emotions made him weak. He separates himself from his friends and forces himself to deal with the issues himself, as well as forcing his friends to face their problems themselves as well. Perhaps expanding upon these ideas can provide greater understanding to Mercury as well as other characters. Because the series is not over. Mercury's story is not concluded. Hopefully he learns that his life can be more than this endless violence, and that he was indoctrinated. And hopefully he can live happily. Thank you for reaching the end of the video. If you would like to see more, please like and subscribe. And if you would like to, leave your thoughts in the comments below, whether or not you'd like or dislike my video or agree or disagree. I would love to have discussion with you in the comments below. I am always happy to talk about this show. As well as thank you to Zach for the editing. Wonderful job. It was very beautiful and I appreciate the work. You did a wonderful job. Thanks, Zach, in the comments. Drink milk and make smart choices, people. Have a wonderful day. Bye.